as soon as. Good morning, everyone. While we wait for everybody to settle in, please introduce yourself in the chat, where you're from, anything else interesting you'd like to share with others. Good morning, John. Nice to see you again. We'll start in just a minute. Finland, wonderful. And Canada, Michigan, California, great. Okay, well, I want to welcome everybody. I'm Eric Mazur. I'm a physicist at Harvard, and I'm delighted to see the continued interest in this PoLS-T network. People are still signing on there. So thank you for joining. This is the third of our series on climate in the high school curriculum. And for today's talk, I'm going to hand it over to Jolene Johnson, who will introduce our speaker. Jolene, over to you.
All right, thank you. So welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see so many of you, especially on a Saturday. We are very happy to have Vandana Singh here. And I'm just going to read a short biography and then introduce her talk and let her take it away. So Vandana Singh is a theoretical particle physicist by training and a professor of physics and environment at Framingham State University. For the past 15 years, she's been working on a revisioning of the climate crisis at the nexus of science, society, and meaningful action, and has developed an always-in-progress transdisciplinary justice-centered climate pedagogy for her general physics classes that has wide applicability across disciplines. She leads the education working group of My Climate Risk, a lighthouse activity of the World Climate Research Program, which seeks to make climate science information meaningful and actionable for communities on the ground. She's the author of Teaching Climate Change, Science, Stories, and Justice from January of this year. So the title of her talk is Beyond the Greenhouse Effect, Climate Change, and Social Justice in the Physics Classroom. One thing, just to give you guys a note, she is going to take questions. You're welcome to put them in the chat, and I'll try to keep track of them. But we're going to hold most of the questions until the end, just so that she can get through all this stuff, and then we'll take them all at the end. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mazur and Isa and Jolene, for the kind introduction and for having me here. I'm really honored to be here. I'm speaking to you from Framingham and from the traditional lands of the Nipmuc people. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And so let's go to full screen and I'm going to start with a story, and this is a story I tell in the classroom. So this story is from the Alaskan Arctic and takes place some 30-odd years ago. It's a somewhat dramatized account based on real accounts that I heard from scientists when I visited the Arctic. So some 30 years ago, a scientist led his colleague across the sea ice in northern Alaska. As you can see, sea ice is the floating top surface, the frozen top surface of the Arctic Ocean in this picture. The intent of the scientists was to camp at the liquid water boundary and study the sea ice. So as they walked across the sea ice, the sky was blue, there was not a wind stirring, there was not any kind of warning from the meteorological office, the ocean was calm. And so you can imagine their footsteps crunching across the sea ice as they walked towards the liquid water boundary. And then suddenly the native elder who was their guide said to them, guys, we got to turn back. We got to turn back right now. No time to argue. We got to turn back. And they looked at him in amazement because everything looked perfect and calm and still. And yet there was so much urgency in his voice that they felt compelled to obey. So as they reluctantly went back towards the shore, grumbling to themselves, perhaps, there was a deafening crack. And they turned around and they saw that the enormous piece of ice on which they had intended to camp broke off and sailed away into the Arctic Ocean. Now, 30 years ago, when there was no Coast Guard presence on that shore, to be marooned on a piece of sea ice subject to the unpredictable currents of the Arctic Ocean was basically a death sentence. So the scientists knew that the elder had saved their lives. And that is one of the stories that I use in the physics classroom. And you might wonder, why would you tell a story in a physics classroom? And so I have to tell you a little bit about my own story, which is a story of initially of a failure. And I always tell my students that failure is our best teacher. So I had to take that lesson into account. So when I first became concerned about climate change and learned enough about it to start, wanting to teach the basics, I was motivated by an ethical impulse that if the younger generation are going to be saddled with this huge burden, this major crisis, then it behooves me to teach them the basics so that they feel that they have the knowledge and they feel empowered to go into an uncertain future and do something about it. So I began in the usual way, the central basic physics of climate change, where it aligns with physics topics in a pre-existing physics course. And so, you might look at, for instance, this chart, which kind of helps more, if you have a general physics course, typical topics in the course and how you can relate it to climate change basics. So we're not going to spend much time here. What I want to emphasize is that my good intentions resulted in both a cognitive and affective failure. So here are some student responses that I collected in the first couple of years of attempting this, more than 15 years ago now. And you can see from here that there are broadly two kinds of responses. The emotional responses of most of the students, many of the students, was basically, instead of empowering them and getting them concerned and ready to roll up their sleeves and figure out what is the wise action we can take, they were in despair, they were angry, they were apathetic, they didn't want to hear any more about it. And the other aspect of it was that, of course, they were picking up, because the public sphere is full of misinformation and misconceptions about climate change. Of course, they were picking up on that. So not only had I not succeeded in having them feel empowered, but I had also not succeeded in kind of inoculating them against misinformation. So I had to go back to the drawing board. And of course, when I dug into the research a little bit, I found that there's a body of research that suggests that knowledge of basic science is not enough and in fact can be counterproductive. So mine was not an isolated experience. It turns out that the politics of your affinity group really, really affects whether a person will accept the evidence on climate change or not. And even when they do accept it, like, for instance, this last item from the Yale climate communication people, that even when they accept it, they're not necessarily motivated to even talk about it, let alone do something about it. And interestingly, science literacy as currently understood is insufficient, because the people with the highest degrees of science literacy were found to be, in one study, the most polarized on the subject. So clearly, although I believe that knowing the basic science is necessary, it's clearly not sufficient and can be counterproductive if we just stick with the science. So, and then in a very large scale, broad-based, global level, macro level survey of conventional education, the scholar Christina Kwok, in an important report in 2020, came to the conclusion that while we might think that education ought to be an ally of climate mitigation, an essential ally of climate mitigation, it is failing. And one of the 5 macro level roadblocks to quality climate education is the lack of radical visions. Now, the question arises, why do we need radical visions for climate education, and what might those radical visions look like? So I'm attempting to go in that direction, but I want to say at the outset that there's no one-size-fits-all answer. There's no silver bullet. My work is always a work in progress. And I'm not sure, for instance, whether it applies very well in the high school domain. So I will depend on my honored audience here to tell me if any of this is useful to you. So I went to Alaska, so I had to go back to being a student of the climate problem and thinking of the climate itself as teacher. So instead of trying to fit it in pre-existing frameworks, could I put some of those frameworks aside and say, okay, what does the climate problem have to teach me? And so here I am on the beach in Utqiagvik, which is the northernmost town in the United States and mostly populated by people who've lived there for thousands of years, the Inupiaq peoples, and most of the rest of the population are scientists and scholars. And there's a wider context to it. So when I tell the story and then we broaden our focus to the context, we know that Arctic sea ice is vanishing at an alarming rate, both in terms of extent and mass. And the Arctic is warming currently about 4 times the global rate. And understanding the context involves understanding a little bit about, we can't dig deep into these topics in a physics class, but we can at least make it apparent that they are there and they're important. So, the indigenous knowledge systems, history of colonialism, the importance of sea ice, both for survival and for cultural identity for the Inupiat. So all of those things come about through the story. So I have been collecting stories like this from communities, marginalized communities from around the world, including, for example, Louisiana in the United States, a village in a desertified part of India, and so on and so forth. And I find that along with working with climate scientists and learning from those who know the science really deeply, because I'm not a climate scientist, there's 4 important lessons. One is, of course, that climate breakdown spans enormous scales of space and time. And the local matters, because the local is where we live, where we experience climate impacts, where we make decisions. And but then connecting the local to the global is very important. And often the mainstream climate discourse is very top down. So and temporal scales matter. So, for instance, every breath we take, we owe in part to the great oxidation events of like millions of years ago, right? But not just that, the 2 weeks of a severe heat wave that is made more probable by climate change, versus the 150 years of the slow rise in global average surface temperature. So all of these scales. The other thing that this story in particular illustrates is the inherent transdisciplinarity of the crisis. So in the story and its wider context, you see the threads of all the disciplines. There's the physics of sea ice and its connection to the Earth's energy imbalance. There is the changes in the ecosystem with the vanishing of the sea ice. There's the sociological impact of all of that on the Inupiaq. There is their own culture and history and so on and so forth. So we can see their sociology, psychology, economics as well, because they have a connection with the oil industry that is really a source of a dilemma, because the oil industry is what is also destroying the sea ice. So the other aspect of the climate crisis is that it's not the only crisis we have, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit later. In fact, we can think of it as an accelerant on a house already on fire. And so we are faced with a polycrisis, which is both sociological and biogeophysical. So, and then crucially, the climate system is a complex system in which each subsystem interacts in non-trivial ways, and I'll elaborate on that as well. And then central to the climate problem are considerations of justice and power. As you can see from the story, the Inupiat did not cause climate change, and yet they are impacted disproportionately by climate change, and that is inherently unjust. They also don't have a seat. Indigenous people in general don't have a seat at the policy table. They don't get to set policy. So there's a power differential there that's really important. So what should meaningful climate education do? And I'll just quickly click through these, because if we have a really major crisis that confounds all our existing frameworks, then we have to try to break out of those frameworks and try to be at least as radical as the problem. And it has to do all of these things. And I'll hope to justify some of this as I speak. I'm not going to do justice to all of these aspects, but I'm going to try to do a little bit. So, and anyway, let's see how much I get to it. So the conclusion I've come to here is that there are at least 4 dimensions of the climate crisis that need to be in a pedagogical framework. And of course, the scientific technological is clear to all of us, but I hope the story illustrates that there's a transdisciplinary dimension as well, where considerations of sociology, economics, justice, all of that comes in. And then there are two others. The psychosocial dimension is really important. And I'm sorry that I won't have too much time to talk about it, but this is about dealing with climate despair and climate grief and apathy. And then there's the epistemological dimension, which I will talk about a little bit. So when I tell this story near the beginning of the semester, I ask students to ask me questions about it, like what kinds of thoughts and feelings do you have as you hear this story? And here are three of the most common questions. Why did the sea ice break? How did the elder know it was going to break? And why are we studying the Arctic? Why are we talking about the Arctic anyway? So it's in response to these questions, and I promise the students that we'll answer all these questions during the course of the semester, that then we can do some systems thinking, and I use concept mapping a lot as a technique. And so we look at sea ice loss and the impact on the native peoples and their well-being and culture, and the impact on the coastal Arctic system. And then we talk about how the sea ice loss is related to planetary level changes, and of course, make a few other connections over here. And so because the local feels real, especially when you tell it in the form of a story, and I also show them a video I took when I traveled to the Arctic, because the local feels so real and relatable, then when we pan out to the global, then things like the greenhouse effect don't feel as abstract as they would otherwise. That's been my experience. So from the local to the global, for instance, when we look at sea ice mass imbalance, then we can connect it to the carbon cycle imbalance and energy imbalance on our planet and global climate change, and then discover that obviously rise in temperature is going to cause a decrease in sea ice mass, but also crucially that in turn affects the global climate change. So connecting the global and the local is really, really important. So one of the questions that I have asked myself through all of this process is like, what are the essentials that everyone should know about climate change? What is the essentials of the science? Now, I know that there are, lists of things that, you should know this, that you should know that, and so on. But what I was looking for was really a framework, some kind of conceptual framework on which you can hang your climate information or arrange your climate information in a sensible, logical way. And so what I've discovered so far is that there are three large concepts, which I call meta concepts, because they actually jump across disciplines, which I wish I had time to talk about today, but I don't. And these are balance, imbalance, critical thresholds, and complex interconnections. And there's a local aspect of them. And here I've denoted how in connection with the story I told you what those local aspects could be. And then you can kind of zoom out to the planetary scale as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all of these, but I also want to address one thing that part of the cognitive failure of my early approach was that climate topics were scattered throughout the semester, and that students therefore had only a piecemeal exposure to climate topics. And then by the time we did, some regular physics, and then we'd come back to a climate topic, they'd have forgotten what we had done earlier. So to prevent this piecemeal learning, which is no learning at all, I came up with this unifying visual tool where each time we did a climate topic, we would look at this tool and we would understand it at a deeper level. So I would introduce it initially through an experience in our planetarium, and then, and if there's interest, I can explain those details later. So I just want to mention that this visual tool that shows the subsystems of the Earth as seen by Earth scientists and includes the modern industrial civilization. And I'll tell you why we use that term if I get a chance later. And also includes the three meta concepts. So at first, all the students know is that, oh, these are the subsystems. This is why we say modern industrial civilization rather than anthroposphere. And then we go on from there. So let me briefly talk about these three meta concepts and how they help kind of collect climate information in a conceptual scheme. And they are each interdependent. So you can start with any of them and discover the others. So the first is balance imbalance. So if you can imagine, like, what I do is I try to stand on the toes of one foot. And because I'm a bit of a klutz, it's hard for me to balance. So I go back and forth like this, but I can typically recover my balance. Now, this is all physics, right? So this is, equilibrium, we all know this. And then I talk about how if you tug on my arm a little bit, I can, and if it's just a small tug, then I can generally recover. So I have some resilience to change. So then we can look at sea ice mass imbalance. And then I do an embodied learning exercise in class to talk about dynamic balance, where we're talking about processes and rates of processes. And so through looking at how sea ice mass imbalance has occurred, because processes that add sea ice to the Arctic are slowing down in comparison with processes that remove sea ice other way around. Processes that add sea ice to the Arctic are actually, I was right the first time, slowing down compared to the faster removal of sea ice. And of course, those are connected to planetary scale imbalances. So we can then say, well, why is this happening? Well, it's because of carbon cycle imbalance. So we do a very, very simple version of the carbon cycle where we only look at the atmosphere as a reservoir. And then we relate it through the greenhouse effect to energy in the Earth system. And so that helps folks understand why we are, what is happening and the difference between, one student jokingly said in the early years that, does it mean, all this CO2, does that mean we should stop breathing out? Well, it's not about that, right? It's about the rates of processes. So this helps to remove some of those misconceptions. But then we talk about, so if you go back to my example of trying to balance on the toes of one foot and I'm going back and forth like this, well, I have some resilience to change. But if you tug on me when I'm, let's say, tilted this way and you tug on me in the same direction, even a small tug might be enough to cause me to go into imbalance, that is in the process of falling towards the floor, towards a new state of balance, which is lying flat on the ground. And so that introduces the idea of critical thresholds. And so critical thresholds here, the way I mean it, is not necessarily abrupt. They can be gradual transitions. They transition regions from states of steady states to non-steady states, where you're committed to change in one direction within whatever time scale that is important to you. So one of the really important researches in the last, so this was research starting from 2009 from Stockholm University, is the identification of what are called planetary boundaries. And these are boundaries or limits that are set by natural cycles and processes and tolerances. And there are 9 of them that have been identified so far. This is active research. So there's a lot of good debate going on about, well, should there be a 10th one? Are there maybe only 8 and things like that? But what people don't argue about is that climate change is definitely one of the boundaries. So is biosphere integrity and so on and so forth. So this is a very important framework pedagogically that I've found for a number of reasons. Now you can see here that in this diagram, what they've identified is that if you stay within the limits of these natural cycles, processes, tolerances, then that is a kind of what they've called a safe operating space for humanity and the biosphere. And what that essentially means is the kinds of steady state conditions that we have enjoyed until recently in the Holocene epoch, where we have, roughly constant average global surface temperature and carbon dioxide levels. And that also has been critiqued as not going far enough. But nevertheless, despite this being, and perhaps because this is an active and exciting area of research, I found it very important and interesting to bring it into the classroom. So the planetary boundaries framework, basically what it's essentially saying is that even violating one of these boundaries can put the biosphere and human well-being in peril. And currently we have transgressed 6 of them. And the 2 biggest pedagogical learnings from this approach. One is that we know that we can't do whatever the hell we want on this planet. We have to respect these natural cycles and processes. This, by the way, is news to mainstream economists and their idea of endless exponential growth on a finite planet. And the other important learning is that it makes it clear that climate change is only one of multiple problems. And therefore, it is kind of the tip of the iceberg. It is part of a polycrisis, that we have all all of these crises to deal with. Nitrogen cycle imbalance is one of the lesser known serious crises. So this helps us to get away from carbon reductionism when we talk about climate solutions. So having talked about all of this, we can then turn to, and this is not necessarily in sequence, like I said, you can begin with any of these meta concepts and discover the others. So I find it necessary, because not part of a regular physics course, to talk about complexity and complex systems, where a complex system is essentially one where the relationships are really important. And importantly, the relationships can change the nature and function of the parts. So the Aristotelian dictum, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, applies to complex systems. So what I do is I start by explaining what is not a complex system. So here you see the innards of a clock. And while it's complicated, it's not complex, because each part has a specific role and function that is fixed. The relationship to the other parts is straightforward. And so if you understand each part and what it does, you've understood the whole. And that's a reductionist simple system. But complex systems typically do not lend themselves to that sort of analysis very well. So there's the human endocrine and nervous systems. There are ecosystems, human social networks, and crucially, the global climate system. So those subsystems of the Earth system that I showed you, they interact in non-trivial ways. For instance, the oceans can be net absorbers of carbon dioxide, as they are doing right now, but they can also be net emitters of carbon dioxide under higher temperature conditions. So the relationships can change, and they can change the role and function of the parts. And so typically complex systems have behaviors where there's much non-linearity, there's multiple kinds of causality. I found Tina Grutz's book on learning causality in a complex world. I believe she's at the Harvard School of Education, really, really useful in discovering the different kinds of causality in complex systems. Simple systems have feedback loops as well, but complex systems tend to have a lot of feedback loops that interact with each other. So here's a very quick example here. So this is something that climate scientists have talked about, that there are these regional phenomena that are either climatic or some aspect of the landscape that can have critical behavior, in the sense that they can go from one state to some kind of steady state to an abrupt transition towards a different steady state. And so you can see some of these, and these are called tipping elements of the climate system. And so, for instance, look at the Greenland ice sheet. If enough ice melts, the thinking is that there will be a catastrophic decrease in ice mass after that. So it's not going to be a linear process. And because freshwater obviously affects ocean currents, that's going to slow down the Atlantic thermohaline circulation, which can reduce moisture levels in the Amazon rainforest, which can increase the risk of wildfires over there. So this kind of causal connection across far separated places around the globe is what climate scientists call teleconnections, and it's a feature of complexity of the system. So the next time that we come back to this picture, we are able to recognize the meaning of these meta concepts. And so each time we come up with a climate topic, we look at this diagram and we say, okay, what did we know before? What do we know now? So every time we are kind of doing it in a layered way, and we are deepening our knowledge of the climate issue. So very quickly, I'm going to talk about how the meta concepts can help us talk about justice, which is integrated throughout all our discussions. And we can ask, so for instance, if you're talking about complexity, we can sometimes the conversation leads to, are there sociological tipping points? Can societies change their behavior abruptly, and so on and so forth? We ask the question, which people, which groups, and essentially we are emphasizing systems. So what systems are driving us into imbalance? And eventually we can blame the current socioeconomic system. This is a diagram that shows economic inequality, but is also can symbolize other forms of inequality, that there's a power hierarchy that is driving the crisis. And of course, the central aspect of climate justice, which is illustrated by the story I told you and other stories I tell, is that the people who have contributed the least to the climate crisis are impacted the worst. And often these people have very important insights. In fact, there's a reason why climate scientists in Alaska are collaborating with Native communities in an equitable way, because they've recognized that there is a kind of science to indigeneity indigenous knowledge that is really, really invaluable. And in fact, that's how the elder knew that the ice was going to break. So, so there are multiple dimensions of justice that we go into a little bit, even though we can't do a lot of it in depth. The story acts as a kind of nexus of all these different threads, and it makes students aware that there is more to this problem than just the science. And we talk about the power hierarchy and the fact that carbon dioxide emissions are increasing every year, despite what scientists are saying. And therefore, who holds the reins of power? Who holds the reins of change? Who is preventing change? And so we get to talk a little bit about these things as well. So lastly, what I'm going to do, because I have a feeling that I'm taking more time than I should, and I really, really want to discuss in the Q&A, I'm going to talk about the epistemological dimension, because that's directly related to our field of physics. So the Newtonian paradigm, what is this? What is a paradigm? A paradigm is a conceptual structure through which we kind of construct our reality, in a sense, right? So the Newtonian paradigm is essentially, the metaphor for that, unsurprisingly, is the clock. So it's a way of looking at the world as though it was a machine. And so it's also called Newton's clockwork universe, although it's also greatly influenced by other philosophers, including Descartes. Cartesian atomism, for instance, is a huge influence. It's inherently reductionist, because the idea is that if you understand the parts, you can understand the whole, and therefore the relationships are assumed to be straightforward and unchanging. It's atomistic in the sense that separability is an essential feature. It's deterministic in the sense that, in principle, Newtonian physics allows us to predict things, and therefore you can control things. It's also impersonal. The clockmaker is separate from the clock. We are separate from what we observe. So while Newtonian physics, we know, is beautiful and useful in its domain of validity, the problem is its influence beyond physics, for instance, looking at the human body as a machine. In mainstream economics, the notion that the natural unit of society is an individual acting in rational self-interest, which is an example of social atomism. The education system, with its fragmented silos of the disciplines, the separation of human and nature, and the assumption of human dominance. So I really like this diagram here, where the XY plane you can see in many some physics textbooks, which tell us the domain of validity of Newtonian physics, which is basically at our scale of things, so roughly between 10 to the minus 5 to 10 to the 22 meters. And we know that Newtonian physics is actually an approximation of more accurate theories, but it works beautifully at our scale. So what I've done here is I've added a z-axis, which is going qualitatively from simple to complex systems, to emphasize that Newtonian physics is very useful at our scale for simple systems, but even at our scale, it's not necessarily wholly adequate to looking at complex systems, because complex systems exist not only within, but well beyond this box. And unfortunately, because we've misapplied the Newtonian paradigm outside of its domain of validity, in well beyond the sciences, our imaginations are trapped in this box. And so that's the challenge of, we not only have to teach the essential science and show the threads and so on, but we have to break that paradigm. And whoops, I think I got the order wrong here. So sorry about that. So stories, I found, are actually really useful tools, because narrative approaches in general, whether they are real-life stories from communities that I've collected, and occasionally I've done a speculative futurism exercise with students where they create their own futures. And then using science as narrative, physics theater, what I call physics theater, which is really embodied learning. And also, very interestingly, narrative approaches that are developing in climate science, motivated by climate scientists, are very, very interesting, because we can capture a lot more through narrative and make it more meaningful to people on the ground and in our classrooms as well. And the emphasis on complex systems, using a lot of concept mapping and emphasizing relationships and changes in relationships, and so on and so forth. So so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, just to tell you that I changed that, the change from the previous slide I showed you about aligning physics topics, that, I integrate all of these meta concepts and justice issues into all this. And I add a week of where we just focus on climate, a lab period and a couple of classes on climate, and we put all the threads together. And we also spent some time critically evaluating climate solutions. So, so in summary, then there are these 4 dimensions of what so far I've discovered to be a effective, or at least promising, pedagogy of climate change, and 3 meta concepts, 3 large concepts centered on justice. And that story is the vehicle to bring this all about. So, and by the way, I'm not the only person who thinks like this by any stretch of the imagination. There's been a very interesting work on science literacy that, the Vision 3, or critical scientific literacy, which is similar, that it's not enough to bring in science and the sociological context of science, but, as Einstein also said, that when you have knowledge, you have to act on that knowledge. It's our ethical obligation to act on that knowledge, and part of acting on that knowledge is to recognize that there are power hierarchies that stand in the way, and so we have to challenge power hierarchies as well. And this is also crucially where the justice aspect comes in. So, of course, we cannot do this with the conventional classroom, the sage on the stage model. And so there are multiple inspirations that I've learned from multiple scholars around, in this endeavor. And so very much so peer instruction from Dr. Eric Mazur, and also growth mindset, Carol Dweck's growth mindset, Ken Bain's natural critical learning environment, multiple scholars of transformational education theory, project-based learning, embodied learning, social emotional learning. So, so all of this, you have to, it essentially is, you cannot do it in a conventional classroom, is my conclusion. Okay, so thank you very much. And here's a little picture of my book. And I'm going to stop here. Thanks so much for your attention.
All right, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I know that lots of you have lots of questions. As you guys are thinking about your questions, if you have a question, you can raise your hand on Zoom, which you can do that. Okay, now I don't remember. Someone else can tell me to do. There's a way to raise your hand. You can also type your questions in the chat and we'll go through them. And just to give everyone a little background, so you guys all put in kind of what you were hoping to learn and some questions you had for the talk. And a lot of those questions centered around, like, there's people teaching in multiple types of physics classrooms and other, like, biology and chemistry and environmental science classrooms. And it's a lot of, how do I get this information? How do I share this? How do I transform this into something I can actually use in my classroom? So I know we're going to get lots of questions like that, and I'm excited to hear what you guys ask. Oh, thank you, Eric. So to raise your hand, click the reactions button. All right, first question. How have students' responses changed after adopting the new approaches in teaching climate change and justice issues?
Thank you for that question. That's something that I have obviously been tracking. And what I find is that although work remains to be done, I found that students are more motivated, that they are more, they're thinking more critically. And one of the things that I do, which I didn't get a chance to talk about, the psychosocial dimension, is that we make it very, I give space to students to talk about their emotions. Now, that's not traditional in a physics classroom. And I was subject to some raised eyebrows from various, anyway, but I think it's really important. So students were able to express how they feel. And I actually collaborated with a colleague in psychology who did a study with the students in my classes over 3 years, actually, and we have to write that up. So simply making space for student emotions. And then I had an environmental poet come and do a poetry workshop with the students, which is also not done in a typical physics classroom. So what I found was that being aware that we have emotional responses, but that we don't have to be stuck there. And then creating a kind of community sense in the classroom so you don't feel alone dealing with all of this. And then also in terms of their understanding, I found that as we use that visual tool, each time students had to maybe present something on it, on climate science, they had to use that tool. And so their fluency with it became more and more became greater and greater. And then judging from, homework and exam questions and so on, I think that their understanding, a lot of misconceptions went away and their understanding actually deepened. So that's why I feel it's a promising approach. But of course, I have the freedom to design my course. And I know that's not the case in many, many contexts. And of course, the context also differs with where you are and who is your student audience. So, so far, so good. I think, Eric, you had your hand raised.
I did, yes. First of all, I really want to thank you. This was a fantastic talk, and it made me think a lot. And I'm sure that for a while I'll be thinking about your talk. So thank you so much for making time to address this very important issue. I mean, what really sort of got me thinking was how you articulated that essentially in the teaching of introductory physics, not just at the K-12 level, but even at the introductory level in college, is that we're really stuck in this Newtonian box, this deterministic Newtonian box, even though I think most physicists who are engaged in research probably rarely refer to Newtonian dynamics. And, unfortunately, sort of the curriculum is often prescribed, but if we had to, I'd like to dream here, if we could somehow shove everything aside and start with a clean slate, I think that we could actually make a radical change and break out of this Newtonian box and actually teach a lot of the concepts that are much more relevant to the world we live in, so that citizens can make more sense of the world we live in, rather than just being stuck in physics that barely makes it to the 1900s. In fact, often it doesn't even make it to 1900s because everything that came after the photoelectric effect is called modern physics. It was 125 years ago or 120 years ago. So can we do that? I mean, if you think about people who design chips, processors for computers, they don't need to go all the way back to understanding, the quantum mechanics of a field effect transistor. They can just, understand in big lines how a transistor works, and from that design logic gates and eventually a processor, or even, maybe not even understand exactly how a logic gate works, but know what the logic gate does and design a processor. So my question is, and sorry for being so long-winded because I'm still thinking about all you told us, is could we actually radically change maybe not just the physics curriculum, but in general the science curriculum as we enter rather uncertain times because of a lot of societal problems? And how would we do that? How would we throw out, a lot of the Newtonian mechanics in order to make space for less deterministic science, including quantum mechanics?
Yeah, you've just described my dream project because I've been thinking about that a lot. And I think that we need to think together on this. We need to, what I call in my book, I call it a diffractive cogitation, where I use the cogitation as co-agitation. So you stir the waters together, kind of thing. So I really think that's necessary, that we can't be stuck in that box, whether it's, and I think perhaps one inspiration might be, I believe that in Finland, for example, they've been doing experiments with, starting with the world and then going to the disciplines. And I think there's someone from Finland here, maybe you can elaborate. But the way I was thinking about it is that, what if we explore a local feature? Okay, so for instance, my university is on a drumlin on a hill. And so And what if we look at every aspect of that hill? You know, its geological history, its significance in the town, or in the history of the town, and so on and so forth. But also the physics of it. And through that discover Newton's laws, but also the other aspects of physics. So we're not stuck in Newtonianism, and not just stay with the physics, but like what saber-toothed tigers used to roam there, and this was what the ecosystem looked like at that time, and so on and so forth. And that's one reason why I was looking for what I think in the history, not history, the what we call it, science, studies of science. There's a term for it that I'm blanking out on, but when social scientists study the sciences, they use this term boundary objects, which are they can be concepts, they can also be physical things that actually help us to travel from one discipline to another. And so science and technology studies, that's what I was thinking of. So it's a branch of sociology. And so I was thinking about these meta concepts potentially because they have applications. I mean, you can recognize them in other sciences, but also very interestingly, indigenous cultures have these meta concepts in some form or the other as well. So if we can find these broad concepts that travel across disciplines and have real world explorations that bring out these concepts, and then discover through them, the various aspects of physics and other sciences and beyond the sciences. Maybe that's what radical education would look like, or at least that would be one part of it. But this is something I'm very interested in talking further about. So yeah.
As am I. So I'd love to continue this dialogue.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, there are many questions, and you were right. There's one person from Finland online, maybe that they'd like to comment, but I'll let Jolene handle the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. I see an Antti. I don't know how to say your name, Savinjan. So from Finland, if you want to comment, otherwise there are plenty of other questions too. And
I really didn't get what they did in Finland. Could you please repeat it quickly?
Oh yeah, I read something about how instead of dividing education into disciplinary silos, there was more of like looking at the real world and then applying the disciplines to it. So,
it is true. They do that in the lower secondary school from age 12 to 16 or so. But when they go to high school or the upper secondary school, there is no such thing at all. Actually, we do have different disciplines. But in the IB, International Baccalaureate, we do have a project in which all the sciences come together. And what you just described about the hill, they take some local idea or some local thing, and then they all investigate it from their own science perspectives. And the students are mixed in different groups. Even though they haven't taken much physics, they might be in the physics group, and they try to learn what the approach in physics is. And then they put all this information together and have a show and kind of trying to enforce this idea that real life is typically interdisciplinary if you want to go deeper into that. Thanks.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
All right, I'm going to go back where Jane Jackson had a question. Her question is, how do you make it local to your students in Framingham so that they're empowered to act locally? So maybe some specific ideas of what you do.
Yeah, this is such an important question. So when I teach about, when I talk about a story from the Arctic, I always try to connect it to what's happening here and now where we are. And so, and by the way, this is not easy because again, I must admit that I have to take out portions of the course to make room for climate change. But I think it's important to do that. So I do that. But here's some of the things that we've done. So that's where an interdisciplinary project can come in. I've been able to do this most successfully, I have to admit, in a freshman seminar, which is by design transdisciplinary, which is called Climate Change and Social Justice in the Arctic and Beyond. So, but among the things that students have done is that we have looked at the impact of climate change in Massachusetts. We've looked at the projections under different scenarios. And one of the most cool things that students did in my freshman seminar was to create a heat impact awareness visual tool, a kind of infographic with a lot of expert guidance. We had a lot of experts come in and talk about, because one of the impacts that we are going to see in Massachusetts is more heat waves in the summer. And because we are not used to that, this is particularly going to affect the elderly and the very young. And so students did, they interviewed seniors at a fair that our nursing department was holding. And then we had expert guidance from our physiology professors and so on and so forth, and a graphic design major. And they actually created an infographic, which they then presented to the City of Framingham Health Department, who were delighted to receive it. So, so there are these sort of things that I have tried. I don't think, so another milder example of it is that can you take what you've learned and give your learning to someone else? So students have presented their learnings to other classrooms on campus. One time, the Museum of Science had a climate exhibit that I took the students to, and they did a very sound critique of the exhibit, which I then communicated to the Museum of Science folks. And then they wrote back thanking the students and saying they'd take their suggestions into account. And these are really empowering experiences for students. Another time, more recently, they made comments on the National Climate Assessment Plan for Alaska, and where there's a public comment period. And I happen to know the person leading that particular chapter. And so I was able to communicate directly with him. And then he wrote to thank them. And then they felt they made a little difference, because he took their suggestions into account. So, so those sort of things, actually, I think really do help students feel some degree of empowerment.
All right. There are a few more questions in here. There's a couple questions around basically, where can I get materials? And like, do you have some materials available, which we can talk about? And there's also a question about, basically, so all of this is complex systems, they're complex, right? And thinking about how you can do this with younger students to still give them access to some of this complexity. And I just want to add before you answer that, feel free for all the audience members, if you have great resources, you can also reply in the chat to people, because we do pool these resources and we also have our coffee talk and can put them together. So don't feel like if you know an answer or have some thoughts, you can feel free to reply. So go ahead.
Yeah, so complexity and young people, it turns out, and this is also, I'm leaning heavily on Tina Grotz's work at Harvard and her book, Learning Complexity hang on a second, I have the title somewhere. But anyway, her work has been really important because she works with, if you look at her Harvard research page, she works on the students she works with include the very young, include elementary age students. And they can learn all this. They can recognize, for instance, that, oh, this is an example of domino causality. So learning causality in a complex world. I think that's the title of the book. And I'll just double check that and put it in the chat. So her book is very useful, and her Harvard research page is really inspiring. So, so I think that tells us that there are actually ways to do that with the very young, and perhaps it's easier with the very young because they haven't had their brains like split into all these silos, which is what happens to us as we go up the education system. So, yeah. Oh, and I should also mention in response to that when I teach about complex systems in the world, and I ask students to think about where they find these systems, their typical reaction is that they recognize that, oh my gosh, the world is full of complex systems, that's the default in the world. And then they want to know, why wasn't I taught this stuff? Why did nobody teach me this before this? If the world consists of complex systems, then why haven't I learned about it? And yeah, so
All right, we have time for maybe one more question. If anyone, I don't see a hand up, but maybe I can't see it. If anyone has a live question and would like to ask it, we have time for maybe one more. Although, as you're thinking about it, I'm just going to remind people too, there's a link to a survey that we'll put back toward the end of the chat here in a second to make sure you fill out after you're done. And then also we have our coffee talk coming up, which that will go in here in a second as well. And I just, as you guys are thinking, if there's one last question, I want to thank everyone. I know that this is a really complex topic, and thinking as educators on how to do this, it's a lot. And I really appreciate the community of people who are discussing this and thinking through how to actually do it. Oh, and I see one question. Go ahead.
I was thinking about that Newtonian physics and everything else. Perhaps the idea of modeling might be helpful here, which I try to emphasize in my own teaching. I mean, we need to choose a model which is appropriate for the task at hand. And then the models, of course, they do break at some point, and it's rather easy to get different models in Newtonian physics and see how they start giving incorrect answers when the resistance of friction becomes important and can't be neglected anymore. So this idea of that if you have a phenomenon which is not applicable in terms of a model we are using, we need to have a better model. So they do not get so fixed with, let's say, how Newtonian mechanics can be applied nicely to a particle or a single body. But if you have a three-body problem, you do have complexity even in the frame of Newtonian physics, which can't be handled anymore, not long to the future. It's impossible, as you're all aware of it. So we do have complexity even in the Newtonian physics.
Yeah, indeed, that's true. In fact, the roots date back to Poincaré, right? We're looking at planetary orbits. And you're right. We in fact, talking explicitly about models and what they do is really helpful because, you know, we talk about, okay, this model, how does this represent the phenomenon? In what ways is it similar? In what ways is it different? And so all analogies have limits, otherwise they wouldn't be analogies, right? So the map is not the world. So I've found that explicitly talking about what a model is and its role in science is important. So even when we talk about, you know, like where we assume in physics that everything's a particle, right? But when you're talking about rotation, you can't assume that. You have to look at, you know, what's happening at the center versus what's happening along the radial axis. So I find that making that explicit. So thank you for pointing that out. It's really helpful even within Newtonian physics. And then it's easier to say, well, the broad-based Newtonian model itself has limitations. So yeah, thank you. And is there, I guess we're out of time, but I did see a question about En-ROADS in the chat. Should I talk, should I just have one line to say about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have not used it in the classroom yet. I've explored it myself. I'm thinking of using it. I think that it's also very important to use it in a critical way because my impression is that it can be very carbon reductionist. And we have to look at all our problems in this entangled way from the perspective of the poly crisis and not just that. So it could be a very useful tool in thinking about climate and then broadening out to say, well, what about the rest of the poly crisis? So, but I'll stop there. Beautiful questions, by the way. Thank you so much.
All right. So we are out of time, and I want to respect everyone's time, especially on a Saturday. Again, this was amazing. Thank you so much. There is lots of stuff in the chat, both resources, which we will compile this. There's also the survey link, and we're going to fix the typo quick for the survey, but you can fill it out. And then we also have another talk coming up that will put that information in the chat. And then if you guys are interested in this and maybe you missed some of it or you want to share this with colleagues, keep in mind you can find a recording of this talk in a few days on our website. And then we would love to have more of you involved in the network, right? We're going to have a whole series of talks on things related to this coming up. So make sure you stay involved and keep the notifications, including for our coffee talk, which is next Thursday, I think. So we'll have a chance to talk more about it and maybe get some more resources. So thank you so much for coming, guys. Stay in touch, and hopefully we'll see you at talks in the future.
Thank you, everyone. Bye for now. Take care.